Hi, everyone. Lisa and Dan here from Fireside Strategic. In the Fireside Chat series, we're celebrating leaders that combine humanity and strategy in their work. Right now, we're chatting with Jon Levy, behavioral scientist, founder, and host of Influencers, and recently the author of Youre Invited. Jon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Are you kidding? I was looking forward to this all day. Finally get to have a fun conversation.
I love it. We love to have fun. Look, Jon, you're well known for your work in influence and networking with really, really cool people. That's really big stuff. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do in this field?
Oh, for sure. So, I think you mentioned I'm a behavioral scientist, and I grew up really, really geeky, like comic book reading, like computer fanatic, back when that wasn't cool. And so eventually I figured that if I could understand how people behave, maybe I could make some friends. And so I initially went into researching or trying to understand the behavior of very influential people, what causes them to connect and engage. And from that, I created a secret dining experience. 12 people are invited. They're not allowed to talk about what they do or even give their last name. They cook dinner together. And when they sit down to eat, they get to guess what everybody else does. At that point, they find out that it's the editor-in-chief of Elle, an 8-time Olympic medalist, a Nobel laureate, the president of a Fortune 500 company. And so I've hosted over 2,000 people at 227 dinners in 10 cities in 3 countries. And my specialty essentially became, how do we create deep and meaningful relationships between people, whether that's a company and its customers, or even a company and its own employees, or people in a social cause, or people and a new best friend.
I love that. So, what is it about these dinners? Why did you land on dinners as the platform to bring these highly influential people in?
So it's interesting. I actually think that business dinners suck. I mean, they're just the worst. Uh, Usually you're in a environment that's way too loud to hear each other. You're stuck between 2 people you don't really want to talk to. Occasionally there's like a guest of honor. They're sitting at the head of the table. They're near nobody. And on top of all of that, depending on the width of the table, you usually can't talk to the people across from you. So it's just like a terrible mixture. What nobody realizes is that it's actually not about dinner. It doesn't even matter that we're like having a meal necessarily. There's this wildly weird quirk of human behavior. And to understand it, I first need to ask you a question. Have you ever been to a party that gives away a gift bag?
Yes.
Okay. What do you do with the gift bag?
It depends what's in the gift bag, but I'd say most of the time I take a glance at it, bring it home. If there's something that's actually useful, I'll use it and I'll think about it. But if there aren't many useful things, I will hopefully recycle it.
Yeah, you toss and regift. And that's almost everything, unless there's like a candy bar you really like or like a coconut water or something. But mostly we get rid of it, which means this idea that, okay, if I give you something, if I try to do something really nice, like, oh, I'll take you for a nice steak dinner or something like that, then somehow you'll like me more, isn't really the case. It turns out that people don't actually behave that way. Instead, and there is an exception to gifting, but it tends to be like a very intimate gift that's personal to the person. So if I know that Dan is a huge adventurer and I think, okay, he's doing this Mongo rally drive across from London to Mongolia. For that, we should probably get him like really funny fuzzy dice for his car that are absolutely ridiculous, that are a great conversation starter. Now that's really intimate to Dan. I've taken a risk. And for Dan, it might be something really special and really ridiculous. And notice it didn't cost a lot of money. But that could be a gift that works, maybe. I don't know. I don't know Dan that well, to be honest. But in general, gifts aren't like a great way to go. Instead, there's something called the IKEA effect. It was popularized by Dan Ariely, a brilliant behavioral scientist. And they found that people disproportionately care about their IKEA furniture because they had to assemble it. And it turns out that anything we put effort into, we care about disproportionately. And so the influencer's dinner actually isn't the dinner. It's the cooking that matters. It's the joint effort. because people don't actually connect when you awkwardly place them in a room with nothing to talk about. People generally connect over shared activities or challenges. So if I ask you to move a table with somebody, you'll start chatting and it'll feel really natural. But if I put you in a room and I say, go network, people hate it. Networking stinks. The subconscious emotional relationship to networking is the need to wash our hands because we feel dirty. We don't feel dirty when we think about making friends, though. And so that's the focus of my work.
I've got to admit, when we first met, I was thinking to myself, ooh, yes, I know Jon isn't the biggest fan for his dinners of people introducing themselves. And so as I was introducing themselves, the sort of description of what they do. And so as I was doing that, I was thinking, here I am telling the person who doesn't love to hear what people do, what I do. I'm really curious why it is, you think, and I totally see where you're coming from, and I think you're right on the money. Why is it that some of these conventions are still with us, of people introducing ourselves to one another and being with one another in ways that don't actually build connection? Why do we still operate that way?
So I think that there's two aspects. The first is that it's really easy and turnkey, right? It's part of our business practices. We have a budget to send people to conferences to quote unquote learn and network. The other issue is that there's a very small percentage of the population that it actually works for. And that's very small, right? And so when something works just well enough that it's fine, we generally don't challenge it. Now that people are sheltering at home and full business cycles are interrupted, we're beginning to realize that our original plans don't really work that well. And now we have to move beyond it. The second is that it takes a lot more creativity and thinking to come up with a novel activity that'll bond us than it does to just copy a format from another conference and slap a sponsor logo. And so it's just harder, right? And then the final thing is that the people who run conferences have a very particular skill set. And that skill set isn't necessarily around wild social creativity. And I really respect what their skill set is, because I don't want to be the person in charge of all the logistics and the check marks of running a massive conference. And so when push comes to shove, it's just a matter of diversity of thinking, right? The people who are planning and designing this stuff don't really have access necessarily to the creative thinkers that would come up with these wild ideas. So I think that plus, I mean, listen, there's a million explanations for these things. And I'm not sure I know all of it because I'm not necessarily old enough to be around when the early conferences were being done.
Well, diversity of thinking is so spot on, and it's something that's so difficult to scale. And I think because you've created events and situations that are a little more intimate, it's very different than somebody's like, I want thousands of people. And I think that's absolutely, beautiful what you capture in this smaller format.
Can I actually ask you about this? What makes you think that it's harder to scale?
Diversity of thinking?
Yeah, and it's not something I've thought about. I'm actually asking.
Well, I think that it's when you need something creative, it's hard to follow a formula. It's hard to have a checklist where you do A, B, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But I think that you have a checklist and you have all these things that you're looking to accomplish, and you have all these goals and all these KPIs, and you get your KPIs and you have a successful conference. I think that when you have people coming in and creating something that's more difficult to control, and you have to allow people to go on their own journey, and that, in my experience, is something that's difficult for a huge institution to tackle and spread in huge numbers.
So I think what you're saying is interesting. I would argue that diversity of thinking is actually relatively easy to scale, in the sense that the hard part is being organized around sourcing the creative thinkers, right? So if instead of telling sales to just make, or whatever, HR just make lists of great salespeople, if you tell them to research the other groupings of thinkers, whatever they may be that are relevant, I think what you're pointing to is what Alan Gannett would call the creative curve. And that's this idea that if something is too familiar, it's boring, right? So the standard conferences are boring.
Yep.
If something is too out there, it's like esoteric, like nobody listens to Bjork, right? I mean, some people do, but like, Dan, when was the last time you heard a Bjork song, right? It's like, so what is it that actually is seen as creative? Well, we need something that's novel enough that it's exciting, but not too out there so it scares us or is weird. And so we need to hit that like sweet spot in the curve. And frankly, that's what's a bit harder. Like, how do you actually hit that sweet spot? And how do you provide it at scale or at with enough opportunity so that everybody feels like they've gotten to get some access to it, or at least the people that are important to us. And with that, I agree. I think that kind of turning creativity into like a production line is a much tougher challenge than necessarily diversity of thinking, which can be done through hiring practices.
I love that. I love the way that you think about it, that rather than thinking about connection as some sort of assembly line, you're taking a much more creative approach to it.
So I actually do view connection as an assembly line.
All right, you keep on. I keep
So-
on saying the wrong things, and I like
No,
it.
no. I think this is great because I've never discussed it in these terms. Let me explain. When I say an assembly line, it seems like it's lacking humanity or passion. In my newest book, Youre Invited, The Art and Science of Cultivating Influence, I present an idea called the path. And the path works like this. Have either of you ever been to Disney World in Orlando, Florida? Yeah.
The California one, not the world
Okay.
one. But
Oh,
go
So you
ahead.
will
I've
not
been
have
to the Florida one when I was 10 years old.
All right. So Lisa, this conversation's to you because he's kind of lame and has never been to Disney World. Clearly his parents don't love him. It's fine. Not everybody's parents love him.
The truth had to come out at some point.
So here's what's interesting. Disney has this really weird design, and I've heard an explanation of why, and I want to run this by you. So when you get to Disney World, you park your car. This is assuming you're not staying on premise, right, at like one of the resorts that are there. You go up an escalator, buy your ticket, and then there's a 23-minute monorail or boat ride to get to the front entrance. Now, Disney's goal, be the happiest place on earth and be a successful business, get every dollar out of your pocket, right? Why on earth would they prevent you for 23 minutes to enter the front gate?
Anticipation.
That's what I thought, right? And I do this professionally. I did not get this right. Now, this may have become more folklore than actual truth. It may have just been designed that way for a bunch of other reasons. But the explanation I was told while researching it was that if you look at the price of a 5-day pass for a family, it's about $1,200. And that's a lot for the average American family, which means that when mom and dad pay, they're hit by the expense. And that's a major downer.
Mm.
So if Disney wanted to let people enter the park when they just had a downer like that, it would negatively impact being the happiest place on earth and their spending. Apparently, 23 minutes is about the length of time it takes to get over that and be ready to enjoy yourself. So here's what I love about this. Disney doesn't try to predict human behavior. Instead, they say, regardless of how you walk in, we're going to take you on a path or a journey so that by the end of it, you'll be ready to actually enjoy yourself. And then they go to the most incredible extent. So the sidewalks in Disney World are a shade of red designed by Kodak to reflect the perfect amount of light onto your cheeks so you seem rosier and happier in photos. And Epcot, every place there's like a bathroom, there's a place to buy something, and so a toy shop and an associated prince or princess or character, and there's a place for mom to get some Chardonnay, right? So every opportunity is a place to engage. And that's what's incredible about it. They design a path or a journey to take people now. Now, I believe, I'll actually quote Dan Ariely, who I mentioned earlier. We were at a conference and he was doing some Q&A, and the question posed to him was, do you think people can make better decisions? And his answer was, absolutely. just not at the time of the decision.
Hmm.
Because once you are already in the area, in that environment, and you are already annoyed by the temperature, or your kids are yelling at you, or a million other environmental factors, you're tired from a long day, then it's probably going a certain way. But if I can design the environment, then I can guide you where I want you to go. So human beings, let's use this analogy for the human brain as an elephant with a rider, right? Our conscious mind is the rider.
John
It's small.
Haidt.
What?
Jonathan Haidt, right?
No, this precedes all of us. I think this is an old, like East Asian analogy, but I think he talks about it. So do Dan and Chip Heath. Like a lot of people talk about this because it's like an ancient descriptor, right? We don't really have elephants here naturally, to the best of my knowledge, right? They're not native to the US.
The best of your knowledge. Please.
Well, if we hang out in Disney World, then we'll find a few.
Yes. So it's unlikely we invented that here in the US. The more important factor here is that if our emotions, our biases, and our mechanics are the elephant, it's much stronger and bigger than our conscious mind, the rider. Then in the morning, our rider is strong. It can kind of guide us to eat a healthy breakfast. But at 6 o'clock, if there's a candy bar on my counter, by 6:01, the elephant has its way because my rider is so tired that it cannot make a good decision. And my rider will come up with the most creative justification for why I deserve a candy bar in that moment. Like, it's amazing. I've never been more creative. And what most companies do is they try to appeal to people's rider. They give us a logical reason. You get this product, it'll have 22 more gigabytes. And that works for some people, that's fine. A far more effective approach is to appeal to people's elephants, right? So Apple makes you feel like you're special, unique, and going to get some action if you use their cell phones. It's so sexy and sleek. It appeals to our emotions. Now we belong. But what's even more effective than that is designing a path or a journey that people can go down that takes their elephant and rider into account, so that if there are no candy bars, the elephant can't wander and eat one. And so you said, John, I like that you don't have an assembly line. You're right, I don't have an assembly line. But what we absolutely do is we design a journey for guests to go down, and they go through it together. And that journey is fundamentally designed so that by the end of that dinner, by the end of that event, by the end of that cocktail experience, whatever it is, they walk out with deep and meaningful relationships with people who were previously complete strangers. And hopefully those people will be friends for decades to come. And that's what my goal is, and that's how we design the path.
It's a super awesome goal, and love how you're thinking about it. Curious that there's a couple of follow-up areas we'd love to dig into, but
sure, let's do this.
One of the most obvious is here we are in pandemic times, and you're probably going to have to get a bit creative about how you structure things in this more remote scenario. So curious, how has COVID impacted how you organize these dinners?
Nothing. We just let people get sick and die.
I figured.
Yes. So first and foremost, we don't do any dinners now, right? I take a huge personal responsibility for the risks that are associated with potentially gathering people. Now, obviously, like somebody trips, that's on them. But like, if we're in the middle of a pandemic, I'm not putting people at risk.
Yep.
So we immediately, when we realized there was a risk and shelter at home orders and all that, even before that, we stopped doing in-person events. That doesn't mean that you can't do safe in-person events, and it doesn't mean that you can't gather digitally. The big issue is, and I go into this in depth in the book, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of why people go to events. So when I show up somewhere, brands think it's because I'm there to be entertained or enlightened, right? I'm either going, much like, why are people listening to this podcast? They want information, or it's like amusing in some way. Hopefully it's amusing in some way. Anyway, the other aspect, though, that nobody really paid attention to at the early stages of the pandemic there are other critical factors. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So what everybody did is what I call a lift and shift. They took their current programming, lifted it, and just shifted onto another platform. But nobody wants to see a Zoom concert. I'd rather just see it on YouTube with better quality. Nobody wants to see that same TED Talk spoken poorly with interruptions and weird things happening in the background. And that's because the reason that I show up to an event, it could be TED, it could be a concert, is also to be around other people with a potential to connect. And I'm not even talking about networking. I mean, just being around other people, getting to experience the feeling in the room. And then the other is that I actually have an impact. I matter. So if I'm at a concert, I'm dancing, I'm screaming, I'm shouting, I'm booing, I'm clapping. I have an impact on the people around me. And without those two factors, and I'd actually argue there's a few others, but for simplicity's sake, those are like the two key ones, then it's just miserable. So if I'm on a tail end of an 800-person WebEx and I could keel over and nobody will care, then why be on the WebEx? I'm immediately going to go wash my dishes or answer emails so I have some kind of influence or connection. And so when we looked at this, we started redesigning all of our events. And the beauty of technology is that it gives the potential for you, an individual, to feel like you're the center of attention because we're not limited by space. And so we took an individual and we said, how do we give them an experience that this is all about them rather than about me being at the front of the room? And what we did was we created a salon series. We do things like anytime we have a talk, the talks are first of all very short so that we don't get tired of perspective fatigue. Right now, you've looked at me from the same angle for the past 20 minutes or so, half hour. And that's tiring. Like TV shows actually switch angles constantly. The other is that we let anybody who's attending ask a question. Then when we go into breakout rooms, we turn it into a game show. So literally like the game shows we've done are Greek or hip hop. Nia Vardalos from My Big Fat Greek Wedding competing against Roy Wood Jr. from The Daily Show. And we present them with a quote and they have to guess, is it Greek wisdom or hip hop lyrics? And then everybody, literally everybody gets to use the polling feature to guess their answer before we announce it. And then we can tally people's answers and see who wins. We can put in people into breakout rooms and let them compete. And the first team of 8 to come up with the answer, well, we had the president of Hanes Brands give a year's supply of underwear to everybody in the winning team. Now that's ridiculous. Like, first of all these people can afford underwear, right? That's not the issue. But the fact that it's being gifted from the president of Hanes is comedic. So suddenly you have this like fully interactive, human connected, novel experience that entertains and enlightens, and people are addicted to it. When we started, we planned an hour and a half of content, and it ended up going 3 hours. By the 9th one, it was lasting 5 hours. Now, I'm not going to take full credit for that. That was also when the riots were going on and George Floyd had just happened, and people really needed a place to connect or a platform. And so it really begins with understanding the limitations of the platform you're looking to engage on, and then seeing how to do it in a novel, connected way that gives people a sense of influence and belonging.
This is so brilliant. I mean, even what I love is, we have some questions in mind to make the content of our interviews extremely applicable to our audience of human-centric C-suite leaders, but you've already answered a lot of those questions in advance, right? This is material that's helpful for people in so many different contexts whenever they engage others. And getting really intentional about how we do that, from designing a customer journey to an employee journey, right? It's all applicable. And I think we're at this point so early on in our relationship with Zoom for so much of society to suddenly be faced with tools like this, not quite knowing how to handle them. This is such helpful context for people to know in advance so that they can be so much more intentional about making this work for all the different kinds of people they want to engage.
I have a small theory that we're going to develop I don't even know if there's a term for it. Let's call it a proximity audio experience. And what I mean by that is that, let's say, Dan, I'm talking right now, and you realize you needed to say something to Lisa. In person, you would just whisper something into her ear. Now, you could do that in chat, but it seems very distracting and like confusing, rather than just saying something like, "Hey, Lisa," right?
This Jon guy, you know?
Yeah, exactly. WTF. So the issue becomes, it's not natural for me to be able to hear everybody at the same level, especially when it's like 49 people on a screen. So how do we give people this sense of proximity? There's this thing called the Allen curve. MIT researcher was curious what the relationship between distance and communication is. And we found that as our desks get closer, communication grows exponentially. And that's kind of crazy. And I mean across all platforms. Like if my desk was next to yours, Dan, we would text more, we would call more, we would send each other more postcards. Okay, maybe
I don't know, Jon, that's very presumptuous of you. Maybe.
Maybe. I'm from Mongolia while you're on your Mongo Derby. So the issue is that seems natural, right? Because it's out of sight, out of mind. And right now, we don't really know how to manage at distance. And so we've been creating more Zoom meetings. But if there was a sense of proximity, like I was nearby, then that might change things. And we just don't know how to get over it right now. So I think we're going to be seeing kind of technologies that try to recreate the mechanics of interaction in space. I don't mean outer space, I mean like in physical space. So it should be interesting. We'll see what happens, right? Whenever there's something like this, we see a sudden influx of technologies and tools and options, and then 97% of them die because they're not that useful. And then we see something kind of come out and reign supreme that we eventually all complain about. So like WebEx.
Like Zoom. I love that earlier you were talking about how technology has allowed us to each feel at the center of an event. And I'm so intrigued by how this could combine with this proximity technology. We may see a fundamental different relationship with space and technology in general.
I think it's going to be really interesting. And I'm very happy to watch it from a distance and personally not try and tackle it.
I'm with you. I'm with you. So you mentioned your book, Youre Invited, a few times, and would love to give you a little bit of space just to talk about the book, what's going on in the book, and who should be reading it.
So who should be reading it is probably the easiest question. It's basically anybody who's literate. And I recommend also buying it ahead of time for all those who are yet to be literate. So yeah, I think the average number of copies each person should have is probably 3 to 4. Like we'll keep one in their car, keep one on their Audible at all times, or audio recorder, or whatever audio platform you use, physical copy, and then a backup just in case of emergency.
Just in case.
Yes.
For your future literate generations.
To come, yes. So I think the biggest point of the book is that the greatest predictor of anything we care about, from human longevity to corporate success, is who we're connected to, how much they trust us, and the sense of community that we share. And the problem is that a lot of what we think is true about these characteristics turn out to be wrong, just like how people try to impress you with steak dinners and swag bags doesn't actually work. And so the book really breaks down how you can use these ideas to create deep and meaningful relationships with the people that are most important to you and your success. Now, that success could mean fitness success and health, or it could mean, taking a company public. But we really dive deep into all of it and look at these really wild and fun stories, everything from the biggest art theft in history, think Ocean's like 11 style, to the abolitionist movement or the history of Weight Watchers. I mean, the stories are completely insane. And one of the things that I really went to a huge effort on was to not tell the same stories that you hear in every other pop science book. So, and I also went to great lengths to include full explanations and examples because, one of my favorite books is Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. But when you finish reading Tipping Point, you have no idea how to cause a tipping point. You know how to like look at the things that may have caused it. I really wanted people to be able to apply the ideas and create communities around them that increase their success, their longevity, and so on. So, like I said, pick up your 4 copies today.
Well, eager to do so. And speaking of fun, we love to wrap our interviews up as we're and I think we could talk for much longer, but given that we're coming up against time here, Jon, I'm curious to know, when you're not influencing the direction of people and companies and thinking about how they can do that more effectively, what do you do for fun when you're chilling out, when you're relaxing? How does Jon have fun?
I'm notorious for my travel projects. So a few years ago, I went to all 7 continents in 1 year. Actually, I did in 8 months. Before that, I did every month, I traveled to the biggest event in the world, wherever it was. So running the bulls in Pamplona, I was crushed by a bull and almost died. I went to Burning Man and, Cannes Film Festival, all these kind of like crazy activities. That kind of stuff was fun. Now during COVID, I've gotten really good at playing video games with my wife. So we like pick a game and tackle it together. And I also take on crazy like learning challenges. So I got a level 3 Wim Hof breathing instructor, and I work with them every week so that I can have better control over my breathing and oxygenation and ability to sustain myself in extreme cold in case I ever go back to Antarctica. So yeah, that's the kind of stuff I like. The things that are kind of weirder and often useless skills, but that are kind of fun to learn.
Awesome. Well, we'll get along. Definitely eager to discuss Wim Hof breathing at some point. It's all cool stuff. Jon, it's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you so much.
Great insights. So useful in so many different contexts. Super rich conversation. So grateful to have you on here and learn from you.
My pleasure. Thank you. And Lisa, thank you as well.